Oftentimes people don't understand the significance of Memorial Day versus Veterans Day. Mm-hmm. And Memorial Day is really, our opportunity as a nation, to recognize and appreciate those that have made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of the country, those that are fallen. You can either be a gunslinger or you can be a gardener. Now, a gunslinger is fascinating to watch. Come in there making decisions, right? People are amazed. Wow, right? This young lady, this guy is just amazing. He's changing everything so quickly. It's just for that brief moment, right? That they're riding high, because there'll always be someone better, stronger, faster.
Hello and welcome to the Degrees of Success podcast. I'm your host, Freda Richards, and today we have an exceptional guest, Dean John Ramirez. He is actually my dean, the Doctoral Studies Dean, so it is my great honor to have him today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this.
My goodness. I've been a little nervous because you are my dean, but I'm so excited. After doing the research about you, I'm so excited to learn more about you. And I'm sure that our viewers and listeners are as well.
And I'm excited about this opportunity because I've heard so much about your interviewing skills. And so I brought, Kleenex and about to reveal to the world all these secrets, but no, I've been looking forward to this, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. I wanted to start off by asking you a question that's not only close to you as a veteran, but to us at University of Phoenix, something that's very special to us. I'd like to know your definition of the significance of Memorial Day and how and why it's important to University of Phoenix.
It's a great question. First of all, I think oftentimes, and what we do at the University of Phoenix is not only show our gratitude for those that have fallen, but it's also an education opportunity, because oftentimes people don't understand the significance of Memorial Day versus Veterans Day. Mm-hmm. And Memorial Day is really, our opportunity as a nation, to recognize and appreciate those that have made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of the country, those that have fallen.
Yes.
And so, the event that we put on every year, this will be the 16th year, is critically important. And I think it draws a lot of focus and a lot of attention on the community, because one, it was a brainchild of an employee. And over the last 16 years, we every year we have a theme, and we convert that theme, right, and put it out on the lawn, using 10,000 flags. And, I think it's something that our employees look forward to because of its significance. And, imagine, if you would, that we've got members of the Veterans Employee Resource Group, 300 strong, along with, other members of our university that come out early and hand place these 10,000 flags. And we leave that message. This year's message is a grateful nation. And so we leave that message and again, to not only promote our theme and show our commitment, but also to reinforce to the community how important Memorial Day is. And then at the end of the week, we'll take those flags and they'll be transported to the local veteran cemetery and placed on the graveside of each fallen veteran. And so, very, very, very. It's a very important day. And again, the difference, is Veterans Day is in which we celebrate all veterans, right? Those that have served and those that are currently serving. But Memorial Day is special because, again, there are literally hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost in defense of this country and the freedoms that we hold dear to us, right?
Absolutely. How special is it to you as a veteran? And one, let me start by saying thank you for your service. I'm a military brat myself.
Yes, ma'am.
You and my mom shared the same title.
Yeah.
So How special is it to you this particular day, seeing those flags floating in the wind?
Yeah.
I know that when I first joined University of Phoenix, I remember seeing the post about it, not knowing this is something that the university did. And I remember getting emotional seeing this beautiful video that was created and seeing those flags floating in the wind, knowing that the university that I work for supports veterans. How does that feel for you as a veteran?
I see it through two lenses. One, the lens of a veteran, right? And how important that day is. Because again, I've served with, a number of veterans that have made that ultimate sacrifice. And the emotion and the loss of life, is deep, right? And it literally scars you, even though, physically well. But those that I've lost, that I served with, forces you to reflect too upon all those that have lost their lives. Every conflict that we've been involved in, people have made the ultimate sacrifice, really, without asking a lot for themselves.
Right.
And as an employee of the University of Phoenix, to know that this organization is committed to our military service members and their families, right, means so much to me because I've been on that side, right? Been away from my family, been deployed, right? Been in situations where you don't have that sense of normalcy, right? Everything is happening around the world. You're focused on the mission. And I think giving our students the opportunity and their family members the opportunity to continue their education with the support of the university, right, gives them that sense of normalcy, right? Because they can interact with their faculty, they can interact with other students. They realize, that, hey, I'm still part of, this world, right? I'm not just here out in the desert or, wherever. And so I think it's also important to them. I also believe that providing a quality education to our veterans and their family members, right, it gives them and arms them, right, with the tools necessary to be productive citizens, right, once they decide to leave the military.
If there was something you wanted to say to the veterans or family of veteran members, just directly to them in regards to whether they're going to be a prospective student or if they're a current student or if they're an alumni, like what words would you have for those students or alumni?
The tenacity and the perseverance that you've demonstrated as a service member or a family member, right? In the toughest of times. And most people don't realize that. And I'm going to go off on a tangent here, right? Service members, we have to remember that the draft ended in 1973. So for over 52 years, it's been an all volunteer force. Every member that is put on that uniform is volunteered to do what they have to do. And granted, there are portions of our society that say, well, they had no other choice. They weren't good enough for something else, so they decided to join the military. Wow. So far from the truth. But people don't really understand what we're asking of our service members. Oftentimes it's glamorized, right? It's Hollywood, right? Whatever you watch in the movies, these gallant warriors are 6'7", 250 pounds.
Right.
It's not like that. It's you're deployed oftentimes, for extended periods of time in the worst conditions. I mean, miserable, too hot, too cold, right? You're oftentimes too hungry, right? Too tired. And at the same time, while you're focused on your mission, you have a spouse, whether it's a husband or wife, right? Who's now handling all the responsibilities of, a two-parent home, right? Not only working, but taking care of the house, getting the kids to school, and at the same time worried about their loved one who's deployed.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that because, first of all of the veterans deserve all of the acknowledgement and they've put in the great work, and the families also have that sacrifice. When my mom was, it was like 6 months after 9/11. It was my senior year of high school. And I put her on a school bus in the middle of an empty Army base. And she was off. And I didn't hear from her for 6 months.
Yeah.
And I spent my first semester of college in my apartment waiting for someone to deliver me a flag because I didn't want to miss it. And that changed my life. Yeah. And I was incredibly sad. And it was a really hard time. And there's not a lot of people who understand, but the people who do are fellow Army brats and fellow military. And I imagine having a group of people to support our veterans or to support the families of veterans as students here at University of Phoenix. Like, I could tell you that as soon as I met you, I knew we had a certain understanding, connected when it comes to being involved in the military, whether family or the one who serves. There's a certain amount of respect. There's a certain understanding. And so to know that our students, that our veterans or family or veterans are also getting that opportunity, and they're being able to see these beautiful flags that are waving on our campus, representing those who have fallen while serving to protect our freedoms. It's powerful. So thank you for being a part of that.
Oh, you're more than welcome. And I do want to circle back on something you said, because, we focus on the service members. Mm-hmm. Granted, they're important. What they do is tough. But I've got 5 kids that my wife raised, right? And to your point, as a service member who's deployed, you miss birthdays. Sometimes you miss Christmas, you miss graduation. And it's so interesting because there is a camaraderie that occurs amongst the military, that you have close friends that you probably still stay in contact with, that you may have met in Germany or you met, in Missouri or Georgia. And it helps you in your social development because, you can go into unknown places and jump right in, mm-hmm. right? But there's also part of your psyche, and I started to realize that as a parent, right? Where I missed some of the most critical times, that I can never, ever, ever, ever get back. And so I think that camaraderie and knowing that I always knew that the Army would take care of my family while I was gone. And I knew that the soldier to my left and right would take care of me and we'd take care of each other, regardless of what was happening, focusing on the mission.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, you've definitely put your time in the military. So I want to ask you these questions. I've told you before, you were the very first person for me to look directly at my notes at, but you are more than worth it. So I want to make sure that I ask these particularly well. So you served 27 years in the United States Army and retired as Command Sergeant Major in 2004. How did the military experience shape your leadership philosophy and approach to education administration?
I had the privilege and the honor to work alongside, to support, and then oftentimes lead some incredible human beings, young men and women. And that's not just the service members, the civilians that supported us on the installations, as well as the family members. The military does a fantastic job getting you into multiple skill leadership schools as you start to go up the ranks. And so, constantly, if not deployed or if not reassigned or, not being a drill sergeant or not doing anything else that they asked, I was always sent to some leadership school. And it was ingrained in me the importance of 3 things. And this is what I always share when I go out and speak about leadership, right? The 3 most important leadership attributes of any quality leader, what I would call a quality leader, is number 1, a leader of character, right? Someone that walks the walk, does nothing illegal, immoral, or unethical, right? And has the courage and the strength to call the baby ugly, meaning truth to power, mm-hmm. right? Takes an incredible amount of courage to do that, especially to, when you're talking with your boss. So leader of character. The second attribute is leader of presence. It's one of the things that I brought with me from the military here at the university in the College of Doctoral Studies. And my provost, Dr. Eilers, is great. A leader of presence, and not just the way they handle themselves and their bearing, their professional bearing, right? But when they walk in a room, they're in charge, right? Just even if they don't have the title, that presence, that competence, right? But a leader of presence is someone who's not in the office, right? Somebody that's out and about. One of the things that the 27 years of military experience taught me was you're going to surround yourself with some really quality staff, right? Non-commissioned officers all providing you advice. But the truth is found with the troops on the ground, right? Whether they were in foxholes, whether they were in the motor pools, right? Whether they were in the mess hall. If I wanted to know what was going on in the unit, talk to the troops, right? Because they would tell you, right, the things that are going right and going wrong, right? No fear. Oftentimes, they're not doing anything with malice, and I'm talking about those in leadership positions, right? That are part of the organization. Oftentimes, they will tell you what they think you want to hear, right? Because again, they want to show their commitment, their loyalty to you.
Right.
And so that is something that I brought with me from the military was get out there, walk the floor, right? Talk to people face to face.
Yes.
And Dr. Eilers and I would, once a week, right? We'd go to our grad team and talk to our enrollment reps and our academic counselors. And you find out everything. You find out what works, what doesn't work, what they need, what they're hearing from, our potential students. And so, again, that leader of presence is important. That final attribute is a leader of intellectual capacity, right? Leadership skills are perishable, right? Because the world is constantly changing.
Okay.
Right? And so, you need to constantly search, right, for information and gain knowledge because you've got to be able to adapt to those changing needs, right? You look at, what we're faced with today. You've got to be a leader who understands the importance of navigating uncertainty, ambiguity, right? If you're never comfortable in doing that or never faced in a situation where you're leading people, right? What tools do you have to do it effectively, right? We're also, faced with times where our employees are concerned, right, about their finances and the economic challenges that they're going to face, right? And so, how do we ensure that we build this level of trust, right, and empathy, right, to say, it's tough out there and we know it, right? What can we do to help you, right? What are the things that we can do to support you? And then there's this other component where we understand that the world is changing so fast, right, that we have to invest in people development, leader development. I can tell you that oftentimes a leader that is not adequately prepared, and I'll use two analogies. You can either be a gunslinger or you can be a gardener, right? Now, a gunslinger is fascinating to watch. Come in there making decisions, right? Shooting, killing everything in sight, right? And people are amazed. Wow, right? This young lady, this guy is just amazing. He's changing everything so quickly, right? But sooner or later, right, he runs out of bullets or she runs out of bullets. Sooner or later, right, there's somebody faster, right? And so, they either get shot on the streets, not literally, right? But it's how the movies normally end, right? And it's just for that brief moment, right, that they're riding high because there'll always be someone better, stronger, faster. I submit to you, right, that leaders should consider themselves gardeners, right, where they have the patience and they take the time to plant the seeds. And I'm talking about the development of their employee, right? Plant the seed, right? Clear the weeds, right? Help it grow, water it, make sure it gets plenty of sunshine. And the fruit that they'll bear, right, will last generations because you create that strong leader, right? They create other strong leaders, right? And they help you build a culture, right? That not only meets the needs of the mission, but also sets up an environment that's conducive, right, to all the things that are important to the organization, right, to meet its mission.
Exactly.
And so
in 2024, you were selected as one of the top Hispanic leaders in the Army. What challenges did you face as a Latino leader in the military? And how have those experiences influenced your advocacy work for Latino students and professionals today?
It's a great question. You know, I've got to go back prior to my enlistment. You know, I had the privilege of being raised by my aunt and uncle, and without going into all the details, you know, from age 3, basically, they brought me into their home, and both, she was Chinese American, right, first generation. Her parents had migrated from mainland China and landed in San Francisco, and then eventually moved to Phoenix, and then my uncle. But anyways, they growing up, when we were young, we were growing up in the projects, and he was earning his education at ASU. And so became one of 3 that got a degree in education because his intent was to teach. But upon graduation at that time, they didn't hire Hispanic teachers. So we had to migrate and we moved to California, and he taught in Los Angeles, East Los Angeles. And we spent a couple of years there. But that experience, when he came back, ignited this fire of activism, right? And so he was actively involved in a lot of things that were going on in the Phoenix metro area. Surrounded himself with leaders like Ed Pastor and Gutierrez, right? Had the opportunity eventually serve as chief of staff for Governor Castro and served with Governor Babbitt, and, was active in Chicanos por la Casa and Val de Sol. And so, throughout high school, these guys would get together on a regular basis and eat breakfast or have coffee. And so I had the opportunity just to hear them and listen to them and all the things that they were working on. May not have understood it all, but I understood that they were focused. And so when growing up, the family overall, my aunts and uncles, especially my uncles and cousins, were able to purchase homes and secure jobs, and because they'd served in the military. My great uncle was a command sergeant major here in the state of Arizona. And so, he'd always bring his, still pot and all his web gear. And so I'd be in the backyard playing with it and, see rations, and he'd make me watch combat. And, he was my hero. He was a Merle's Marauder in World War II and did the Walk of Burma. His 2 sons served in Vietnam. And so, I was just, always listening to their war stories and stuff, and it sounded so cool, right? And so when I made that decision to join the Army, and there was a number of reasons why I did. I was going to college and actually crossed the street because I got frustrated and went to the recruiting station and joined. But it was interesting because come to realize real quick, a lot of those were war stories, and they remember all the good times and, the fun times. And it was unique because, I joined in 1977. And so the Vietnam War was coming to an end around 1975. And so you still had a lot of service members that had served in Vietnam that were in the military. And most of them were disgruntled, that they really were, because of what they endured in Vietnam. And so it was interesting because there was still, and you have to remember that, 1965, to 1973, they were still dealing with issues like, the right to vote for African Americans. There were still issues that were going on that resonated within the military. And so, as a person of color, right, I was, because a lot of our officers and senior non-commissioned officers, were white. I think, I remember I had one first sergeant that was Hispanic, and one commissioned officer that was African American, in the whole company, right? But the ranks were filled with minorities. But it was interesting because the environment again was different, because oftentimes, they would ask me, "Do you speak English?" Right? Just surname. Of course, I speak English, right? Or you weren't good enough because you were of color. And again, it wasn't as prevalent as it was 10 years before that. But a couple of things had occurred to me right away. And I learned this from that one Hispanic non-commissioned officer, First Sergeant Rocha, Vietnam veteran. He says, "They're not going to give you anything, right? You've got to earn whatever it is that you think you can achieve." So he says, "I'm going to send you to school, right? It's not going to be easy. You're not going to be," I was a newlywed too, 17. Literally, we got married young.
At 17.
Yeah, and my first year I wasn't even with her because I was, either in training or deployed. But he told me right away, you have to spend a lot of time with your family. But at the end, it'll pay off, right? To stay focused. And it's the same lesson that I learned from my uncles, right? Is that just show them, right? Show them what you're capable of. And so every school that I took, everything that I, when it came to training, right, may not be the biggest, right? But they're going to get 110%, right? And I'm going to earn, right, whatever it is that comes my way. And that paid major dividends for me because, I rose through the ranks really quick. I was an E7 by 8 years. First sergeant by 10th, by 12th, 15th, 13th was sergeant major. And so, but it was always having to prove, right? And so you had to stay up a little later, you had to work a little harder, you had to multitask, right? And so those experiences, and again, I didn't concern myself with, the issues of, bias or prejudice, right? It was just, I'm here.
Right.
Right. And, when I was given opportunities to lead, right, I worked to be the best leader that I possibly could. Wasn't, right? Because I'm always learning. I'm still learning every day. But I was going to be the best leader that I could muster, right? Be the best at whatever it was.
Right.
And so through that experience, again, a lot of things, came my way, right? And so, I'm sure you read about, in 2004, the year that I was going to retire, I was selected as one of the top Hispanic leaders, in the Army, which was a tremendous recognition. But I remember upon receiving that award, it's like, I don't want to be perceived as a Hispanic leader. I'm a leader in this organization, right?
Yes.
And if I can be respected and recognized in that way, I'm good to go, all right? The fact that, I'm Hispanic of origin, right, should not be, right, the thing that sets me apart. And I don't want to be recognized. Well, of the Hispanics, he's the best leader.
Right.
Right. And so
you were simply the best leader.
Yeah. And so, or at least I thought, right? But I carried that with me when I got back home, because through my experiences in the military, I learned a couple of things, especially serving in third world countries, whether Central South America, whether it was in, Central or Eastern Africa, was that there's a fine line between poverty and prosperity, between enslavement and freedom, and success and failure. And that fine line is access to information, knowledge, power.
Yes.
Right? And oftentimes in these third world countries where you have dictatorships, they suppress information. They keep information from you. They keep you from being educated, because then you start to ask why.
Right.
right?
I couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
being with us. Somehow that brings us to the end of this episode. I could stay in this chair with John Ramirez all day. I'm learning more from him. But I'll tell you what, I know that you all have learned a lot from this episode. I know I have as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Though we're at the end of this episode, we're encouraging you to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm your host, Freda Richards, reminding you that your next chapter might be your best one yet. See you soon.